Hello everyone, hope you're all doing great. I hope you all enjoy this compilation. Now I have some thoughts I just wanted to share before the video starts. To those of you that want to listen and are receptive to it. There's the timestamps too, so if you don't want to listen to this part and go straight into the compilation, you can. Now as always, this is unscripted and I'm literally just hit record and want to share some of my thoughts with you. But I know it's going to help people, so that's why I want to do it. Now, I just want you to understand that when you're getting better and you're really working on improving your life, it's always going to be up and down. And some days it's going to feel like you do everything right, but nothing changes, or you'll have people letting you down and you'll just feel empty at the end of the day. I know because I'm there way too often. But the moment you accept this is how it is and that you can only control what you can in life, things will start to get better. You have to understand that you need to love yourself and do everything for yourself and believe in yourself. Everything else external to that is really out of your control. Whoever's going to like you is going to like you. They'll know within a second and if have made their mind up, and there's nothing you can do to change that. The moment you understand that concept, it will make a big difference to your life, like I know it did for me, because I spent way too long trying to change things that were out of my control, and all it did was lend me to overthink and really get into negative places. Now, another thing as well that I really understand about myself is that, let's say that I'm having one of them empty days. Now, I can only say this next part because I've been there a million times and I understand it well, being in a better place now, but my mind knows my story better than anybody else. My mind has the most control over me because it knows me and every excuse in the book and how I work. What happened before was I would really quickly slip back into the dark place in my head, and that was because of years of negative cognition and untapped thinking patterns becoming really toxic, so that was the norm for me. And your mind's always looking for the path of least resistance. So when you understand this, you'll know that if you're having a worse day, your mind naturally wants to go straight into the dark place, and for me that is being very alone in my head. And now I understand that as hard as it is, and as hard as every fibre wants to go back to that negative place, it's up to me and only me to work out of it and get out of my head. And whether that means literally slowing down what I'm doing, focusing on my thoughts and getting rid of the negative ones, then if I can do that, I can start to get out of my head and win control of my own mind. With getting better like this, it really is a psychological warfare that you're playing on yourself every single day. And the moment you realise this, the better it can be. Because I know how it feels to have everything in your body trying to go to a negative dark place, and it feels like there's no light or anything around you. And it feels like you're all into the world and got nothing back. I know how horrible it is, but I also understand that this is in my head, and it's only me that can get me back out of that place. And having total acceptance of everything really makes a massive difference for me. So I accept, yeah, it sucks, but it's up to me to get through this, and it makes a massive difference for me. Because I'm someone who feels like they've spent 99.9% of their life alone, but since I've come out of that dark place, I can see that it just wasn't true. And honestly, the amount of opportunity that will present itself to you and how many people out there actually love you is unreal that you just haven't met yet. It's all gonna come. It's just your mind wants to tell you that, oh, this can't happen because of this or that. But understand that it's just years and years of your amygdala and negative cognitions building up, which is making you actually think and feel like this. And just expanding further from what I said earlier, this is really something you have to work on every single day. It's not going to be easy, but know this, that growth only comes through resistance. And think, if your mind can get you into this kind of place in a negative light, imagine if you could flip that and put it into a positive light, how much you could actually do. Because that's what I forget about myself sometimes. Like, I've managed to do all of what I did, feeling at the bottom of the ocean, spending 99.9% of my life completely alone. And I think, what else can I do where I'm getting better now? And I'm only just starting to see the potential in it. But the most important thing for me to do is see past my negative thoughts and live in the moment. Because I could go up Mount Everest right now, have like a beautiful wife and kids or whatever, and just see none of that if I let my head do it. But this is my head, so it's for me to own. Everything in my life is mine to own and to overcome. I know that I'm greater than any obstacle that's in front of me, and I know the same with you. I know because I've been there in that dark place, feeling like nobody wants to help me. I realise now that there are other people out there who love me and want to help me. It's just all a mind game, so you really have to understand this. And what we're dealing with depression, anxiety, or whatever problem you're going through right now, it really is the hardest thing on earth to go through. And don't worry if people don't understand you, it's fine, it doesn't matter, because at least I do, and you understand yourself. And the only person that's going to help you is you. I promise you, the second I realised this and I made up in my own mind that I wasn't going to be a victim of my past, everything changed. And honestly, it's something you have to live to understand, and I want you to as well. I know you're capable of anything you want to do. You have to stop caring about what anybody on earth thinks about you, because realistically, the only persons whose thoughts actually matter are your own. You know what you're capable of, and like I said, your mind is literally your most powerful weapon, so you just have to use it to yourself and play the tactical advantage in your favour, not against you, because your mind always has that advantage over you, and you have to remember that. So the way that I specifically overcome this now is, I always have lofty goals anyway, and that's just a part of me, but having total acceptance of everything, understanding that I have to talk to people to get out of my own head. If I don't talk to people, then I'll just be stuck in my head all day, and there's nothing worse than that for me. So if I can do that, I can start to get into the moment, because otherwise I ruminate and I really get into stupid places in my head, and I just think negative things non-stop, and that causes me to panic and start to get into my sympathetic nervous system and make stupid, rash decisions, and that never works out well for me. So if you're listening to this, you can change your life right now. Don't wait another day. Like I said in my other video before, the most important step that you can take is the next one forward. Nothing else matters, literally. You're in control here, and you can go and be whatever you want. Don't let anybody tell you what you can or can't do. You deserve to be happy, to live and enjoy your life, not held down by mental barriers or illness like I was once. You can overcome all of them, because I did. Though depression can make your world look very dark, and it can seem like there's no light around you, I'm telling you there is, and it's better on the other side when you come through it. I mean, even now I appreciate the fact that I'm just breathing air. If you went back 2 years ago, I would not have been able to say the same thing. And that's crazy for me even saying that, just hearing it from myself, to be honest. I'm telling you this and my story and pain just so you can see that you can actually overcome this too. Nothing's impossible. You have to make up in your mind that you're not going to give up. The second you do that, it's like something flips in your head, and suddenly you start finding ways through things. And you have to think, every single day you do this, you're going to become stronger and stronger. And don't view it as a curse that you've got these things, because that's another mistake I used to make. View it as a blessing, because it's made you this much stronger. You're still here today fighting, and that just shows how strong you are. Some people will go through their entire life never experiencing anything like this, and you have, and you've overcome it to this point. Understand that. And like I said in my other video, your success will be as great as the odds that you overcome. It could be the smallest thing, but if you fought that much harder, then you're going to enjoy it that much more. But understand, it's not going to be easy. There's going to be resistance every single day, but you have to fight yourself at every corner. But you can overcome it and come out on top of it. I believe in you and I love you. And sorry if this was a bit unstructured and didn't necessarily have a direction. It's just I had a lot I wanted to get off of my chest really, and share that I thought would be able to help people. Because to be honest, sometimes I feel like I don't want to share certain things because I think, oh, it's going to sound too dark or negative. But I've realised that, no, every time I do that, there's people that say they feel exactly the same as me. And for me, that's crazy, to be honest. And that leads me to my final point before I forget it. If you can help somebody else out, it can really help you get through a rough phase. I find that I don't love myself, like I know that anyway, but I'm much better at loving and helping other people. Obviously be very careful who you do this with, because some people will just be out there to take advantage of you. But if you focus on other people during a dark or hard time, suddenly it's not so bad. You're suddenly not thinking about yourself, and it can make getting through them times a lot easier. I mean, for me, I had a family member who, I don't want to go into too much detail, I will one day because it's a big part of the story, but wasn't well. And me helping them really helped me get through the darker phase in my time, because I didn't have time to constantly think about myself and be stuck in my own head. But yeah, that's just my closing thought really. So like I said again, sorry if this feels like it's rambling or whatever, and I'm going to do a really long video on this. I've just wanted to set it up perfectly to help as many people as I can, so sorry that hasn't come yet, but I just really hope that with everything that I've shared just now, I can make a difference to somebody, because I know somewhere somebody needs to hear this and it's going to make a difference to their life, and if I can help them then I will. So I love you, and I'll speak to you all soon. Make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. And enjoy. I went camping near Solvang, CA, with just myself and my 18-pound skanoodle. It was early in the season, maybe early March, and there was no one else in the camping area. The campground didn't have any hosts. It was first come first served per you go in a Dropbox type of place. The campground was on a slope, and there were trees, but the trees are very thick, so you could see most of the campground if you're on the top part of the slope. Since I'm alone, I picked the campground on the top right. It was a pretty remote area, so it's pitch black at night. Everything was good for a couple of days. We went back to the beach and walked down and did a lot of droning. One day, there was this truck of about 3 guys that came down to the campground, and they were shooting at the trees, smoking weed and drinking. The moment they see me, they start staring at me hard. I'm a female, so feel uncomfortable and go to my tent, and they left. Later on at night, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine and bright lights. I peek out of the air vent in the top of my tent, and all I could see was a truck parked right in front of the campsite. The high beams are on, and I couldn't see anything else because of it. The truck stays there for about 30 seconds. Then all of a sudden, the horn sounded. My poor dog who was barking starts to whimper and shake. I don't know how long they were there for, but it felt like an eternity. Eventually they hit the gas and come flying up the slope. I think they're gonna hit me. I freak out and quickly get my dog. They flew right by the tent, nearly hitting us. They drove down the campground, not on the road but through the campsites and through to the grassy area. I don't know how they missed us. They started firing guns too, and the bullets aren't far from where I am. Writing this out now, it doesn't seem very scary, but it was terrifying at the time. I don't know if they were going to come in to kill me or worse. I don't know if they were going to run me over and shoot me. I'm just glad they didn't get me. Growing up, I had a childhood friend that lived relatively close by, and we were like 2 peas in a pod. We're both adventurous, believed in the paranormal, enjoyed astronomy, and generally just being outside. She was born in Alaska, and her dad had lived there for quite a while, so they're always camping, hiking, fishing, skiing, you name it. It was with my friend's family that I got actually introduced to being outside and doing camping with. Now this actually happened during the late to mid 90s, when we're maybe 10 or 12 years old. On one particular camping trip, we went to this lake in the forest that was surrounded by a meadow, and feeding the lake was a small stream leading out to the woods. Anyway, we played in the meadow and stream all day while my friend's dad fished. The lake wasn't very big, and because it had a meadow all around it, he could keep an eye out to the whereabouts while we fished. Now while I'm messing around by the stream, I get some weird vibe from the wooded area that I can't explain. Anyway, the day faded into early evening and it was time to leave and find a camping spot. My friend's dad packed up his fishing gear and we walk all the way back to our truck. It's winding through the woods. Once we're in the truck, we drove into a more remote area and we made our way up this steep road that was rough, at such an incline. I was convinced my friend's dad was going to break his truck. He had a 4, maybe 6-cylinder Toyota pickup truck, which is about as basic as you could get. To be honest, I don't even know if it had 4-wheel drive, but being an Alaskan outdoorsman with years of experience, I trusted him. We finally made it up to the top, which was flat and relatively open with a big forest area in the opposite direction from the road we drove up. We pitched our tents, got everything set up, and a friend and I decided to explore. We may be 50 yards from the tent when we heard a big crack as a tree branch snapped behind us in the woods. We got quiet, and look in that direction but can't see a thing. Thinking it was just a deer, we brush it off. But we hear it again while we're walking, and whisper to one another that it could have been an animal. I stopped briefly, and when we were about 200 yards away, we sat on a boulder looking down the steep downwards area near the woods, and suddenly, we hear another cracking branch from behind. Whatever it was seemed to be following us. Our imaginations are going wild. We came up with everything from a serial killer stalking us in the woods to Bigfoot. When we got back to the campsite, we told our dad what we heard, and how it seemed to be parallel to us. He just plays it off though as a black bear, and maybe he's just looking for food. So later on, my friend confided in me that her dad had gotten his pistol out, and would be sleeping with it that night. My friend and I were sharing one tent. He has his own tent not far from us, so I feel pretty safe. Now, I don't feel perfectly normal. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to hear something or someone walking outside. I lay still listening. I could hear it quietly circling the tent. It sounded like it was walking on 2 legs because it had a distinct rhythm. Whatever it was, it sounded big as I couldn't hear its weight. As it puts each foot down, it seems to be getting closer. I can even hear relatively quiet but deep breathing. As I lay there listening, I could hear it wandering to other parts of our campsite and back to our tent, almost as if it was walking in a big loop. I don't know how long this goes on for. It feels like an eternity. I'm terrified and unable to wake up my friend as I lay there listening. Now the next morning, I told my friend and her dad about it, but I don't know if they believe me or not. Interestingly, absolutely nothing in the camp was disturbed in any way. The ground was very soft and in some places was covered in grass, and there's no footsteps either. This is something I've never been able to explain, and to this day still lingers in the back of my mind while camping. I always wonder what was lurking around that night. I grew up in a somewhat remote mountain town in California. When I was 12, me and a few friends were hiking up an old fire road with my dad. As we're reaching the end of the trail, we notice a person face down in a ditch wearing a red flannel jacket with jeans on. As we get closer, we saw a rifle and long grey hair scattered everywhere. It smelled awful. We pause. My first thought is that it must have been a prank or something because it's around Halloween. But I was wrong. My dad told us to stay where we are. He walked over and found out that it was someone who wasn't alive anymore. I went out camping alone one night in a nearby forest to where I lived. I had a really good day and enjoyed the solitude. I went to bed and had a feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't quite shake it. I managed to fall asleep eventually, but it must have taken hours. I'm awoken by what I think is my boyfriend tugging at me. Then I realise that I'm alone in the tent and he's out of state. I scream, turn on my flashlight, and I don't see anyone. I think it's just my imagination playing tricks on me, and I eventually go back to sleep again. When I wake up in the morning, however, I found out it's not just my imagination. There are footprints all around my campsite and multiple cigarettes lying on the floor. I went camping in an abandoned building once with some of my friends. I know how stupid it is now, but at the time, it seems to be a great idea. Everything seems normal at first. We are getting scared, but it's just by each other making us jump. Now, as midnight strikes, all 5 of us are sleeping in the same area, except for my one friend who goes into the other room. He keeps on whispering things at us through the doors, and we tell him to shut up and go to sleep because it's late, but he keeps on doing it, and keeps on punching on the windows. Then I hear my friend next to me say, "What are you guys talking about?" Immediately, we all dart up as we realise all of us are in the exact same area. One of my braver friends quickly shines a flashlight into that room, and it's locked. No one's in there. Needless to say, we all bolt out of there screaming for our lives and never went back there again. Normally, I would think it's my imagination, but all 6 of us heard the exact same thing that day. So I was a wildlife firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern proportion. But I worked on the southern area of the forest, and that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to go work for it. Now, the fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out, and one that was about 2.5 hours away up a windy road. The remote dusty station had an old Forest Service ranger station, and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people go on their phones all day. So for my story, I want to keep it pretty simple, but my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, which is sleeping outside with no tent. Imagine the spiders. And he kept getting a weird musky drop-off liquid on his face. Now he's really in the middle of nowhere, and he kept looking around and yelling, and no one's around him. He told me he wasn't even below a tree, so it's not tree sap. He never slept outside again, which leads me to believe how weird the experience was for him because he loved being outside. Now for my story. I had other interesting experiences at a remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was on the night of 4th of July, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes, having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room in a double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started to doze off, but felt awake. I then hear one of my co-workers outside my window asking me to come out. I was laying down, facing the window and don't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. I felt as though something tall was looming over from outside. They kept beckoning for me and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice became very deep and angry. They started swearing at me to get out. It was almost a demonic voice. I lay there frozen, not wanting to move a muscle. They yell at me, and eventually, It stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and asked why my co-workers were out there, but they look so confused when I tell them this. They say that none of them were up that day, it was only me. I'm used to having spirits around. I've always believed in them, and they're pretty much normal for as long as I can remember, but they've never terrified me. I remember my grandmother talking about spirits when I was little. My oldest son, before he deployed to Afghanistan, had the uncanny ability to tell me when someone was gonna die. And I've had my own personal spirit friend I called Fred for as long as I can remember. But this building is completely different. I've never had any place give me such creepy vibes. Now, it's crazy in this one. I could have the heat up to 80, but my fingers are so cold that I can't even type, and my nose is left constantly running. Now, it's night shift. No one gets in or out without the door chimes going off. I've heard someone sneeze in the hallway out the side of my office. I hear chairs scrape across the floor in the squad room, when I know I'm the only person there. I've seen one apparition, a blonde-haired girl with grey sweats pull up to her knees, and a white cotton-up shirt, blonde hair with dark roots girl with tennis shoes. I've seen her pure as day. Now, I've seen them walk from the bathroom to the squad room with her hands across her face. I literally thought someone was in the building, so I called an officer. Now, there's only one way in and out, and I know she didn't go past me. We found no one. Now I work for a tribal police department in Oklahoma, so this was all Indian land at some point. But that wouldn't explain the girl I saw. I work the night shift, and I've learned the normal sounds of the building like the ice machine or the wind blowing through the attic. But some nights this place just gives me icy chills. Just that feeling you shouldn't be there, and I've heard my name being called. Sometimes my middle name, which is really creepy. We've had a couple who worked here and have been terrified and left without even saying why. Now every other place I've worked, I've always had the same little what I call Fred pranks, where drinks or pens disappear and I find it somewhere else. But I never had anything like that happen in that place. I posted quite a few times about my experiences, but I somehow glossed over my time in high school when I worked as a bag boy at a local supermarket. I grew up in a farm town, and the only place you could get groceries, besides a grossly overpriced Shopco on the edge of town, was a family-owned supermarket, Robertson's. The Robertson's family was very active in the community, but had a reputation from misery to straight up being evil, depending on who you ask. If you ask me and the rest of the bag boys, it had a dark aura about it. Many features contributed, like the vaulted ceilings in the back room, the creaking floors in the upstairs offices, and the door hidden behind a pile of old shelves that seemed to lead under the loading dock. Now the worst of the Robinsons was Ryan. He was too old to handle business decisions, but was too stubborn to let his tube-topping son take it out of his hands. So he spent his days shuffling around the floor, antagonizing the bag boys at every turn. He would moan at us if we clocked in 1 minute early. He'd moan at us for standing at the cloak with a minute left on our shift. He moaned at us about our laziness the second we weren't moving stuff. I always joked that he's a vampire. He refuses to die. Why else is there never a call over the intercom for kids who lost their parents? One night, my suspicions are reinforced. Ryan had showed up at 9 to take care of some of the office work upstairs. With all of our closing duties done, my partner for the night and I lollygag in the stock room, right at the foot of the office stairs. When 10 rolled around, it's time to close. I figured I'd let Ryan do the locking up. I started up the stairs and realised it's dark. I got to the top and look around. Not a single light in the offices is on. We had stood at the bottom of the stairs the whole time, and Ryan hadn't passed us. Even when Ryan isn't looking scary, strange things happen upstairs. The exposed water pipes leading upstairs twang like somebody's hit them with a hammer. Footsteps on the creaky floor would always echo. All of this happens when the offices are pitch black too. Now one night, my partner and I freaked out by the noises, and decided to spend the remainder of the shift lapping the store. As we were walking perpendicular to the aisles, a can of green beans halfway down the vegetable aisle suddenly fell off the shelf. We put it back on the shelf and start walking again. We don't think much of it. Then, 2 aisles down, another can falls off. This time, as I put it back there, a can 15 feet down the aisle flew off the shelf. We left that one sitting there and huddled around the cash register. And to top it off, a bag boy requested to be taken off of night shifts after an experience he has in the break room. The break room had 2 small bathrooms, male and female. Now he's taking his food break when he heard a baby crying from the woman's bathroom. He'd been in there for 5 minutes already and not seen anyone come in. Definitely not with a baby. He endures 10 minutes before he gets so concerned. He knocks on the door, repeats the knock and questions, and gets nothing back. He finally is convinced that something dodgy is going on and left. I'm a 20-year-old college student who works part-time on weekend nights as a security officer on campus. My partner's a 22-year-old male student, same situation, same company and job. This experience is theirs. We're both currently on duty at different posts and they messaged me about it a few minutes ago. So my partner, I'll call him Jay, is currently working at the front desk on the Fine Arts building of the college. That building's on Broad Street, the main street of our city. It's around 3 AM at the time, and there's usually only going to be the occasional student coming in and out of the building and a pedestrian on the street every now and then. Jay's security camera shows that the area just outside of the building, including footage of the dumpster, parking lot and sidewalk out front, which is well lit by street lamps since it's on Main Street. The cameras have about a 5-second delay, but show very smooth footage. Jay messages me and says, "I literally just saw a person dissolve on the camera system, like the wind blew them away. It wasn't any kind of screen or anything." Upon questioning him, they told me that they saw what appeared to be 2 figures wearing their hoods up, and they're almost identical walking together. They said only one of the figures dissolves, and that the one who was solid didn't seem to realise the other person was there. They didn't seem to be talking, and when the figure dissolved, they didn't seem to notice. The solid person's walk and cycles didn't glitch out when the other person's did, and they're off sync. The camera seemed to be working well. The figure didn't appear to glitch out or pop out of existence. It's described as almost dissolving into the wind. I'm wondering if anybody's had any similar experiences to this. So this happened after work this past Christmas Eve. I worked a later second shift from 5 PM to 1 AM, or until we're done. I should also mention that while the warehouse is in a nicer area, a couple blocks down it gets sketchy at night. We get done at around 2 AM, so it's me and my one friend who are first out the parking lot, and we're standing there talking while we're warming up our cars. We were talking for about 5 to 10 minutes, and during this time, I saw a small sedan drive by slowly but didn't think much of it because it was a little icy out and we figured they were just being curious. But then, I saw it slowly coming back down the road, came from west and pulled in, and parked in the parking lot across from us, which is strange because it's a welding shop parking lot, and no one's ever in there past 10 PM, besides the police doing speed traps. At this point, I pointed out to my friend that this is weird, and they think the same. Then this big guy got out of the car. The other car that he's in drives off, and he comes over to me and my friend, asking for a smoke. Now, thankfully he didn't talk to me, but as soon as I stepped back out of my car with the wallet in my hand, so I could use one of my cards to scrape the window, he called over to me. I don't want to be rude, even though something felt off about the situation, but I thought, hell, there's cameras everywhere. And I'm not really worried because everyone will be out in 10 minutes. Now I'm 6 foot and 180 pounds soaking wet, and the guy's a good bit bigger than me. I'm guessing 6'2" or 4, and a solid 250 pounds. He was trying to make small talk with me, asking me about what we do there, how it sucks that we have to work on Christmas Eve. Just random crap like that, but I got the feeling he was sizing me up. So, even though I have extreme social anxiety, and can usually barely make eye contact with people I know, I remembered my grandpa always telling me, if I'm in a sketchy situation with someone, just to stand tall, chest out a bit, and make direct eye contact the whole time. Especially do that whenever you look like you might be scared or nervous, so they know you're not worth messing with. I saw him looking down towards my wallet, so I took a small step back to make sure I'm in sight of the cameras. Then he said, "Hey, could you give me a ride to my house? It's just down the road. I ran out of gas at the store and need to get back, and I have no money." Now the grocery store, he said his car ran out of gas. The story keeps changing, and he come from another direction from the one he pointed at. I then remembered reading online somewhere that around the holidays, people will do whatever they can to get someone to give them a ride, then force them to go back to their house and rob them. Now I know I'm not going to have this, so I walk backwards towards my car. I know that I have a giant utility knife under the seat and tell him I'm good and to please get off the property. And he's like, "Come on man, it's Christmas Eve," looking annoyed. At this point, I'm at my car and he can see me reaching under the seat. He then turns to walk away into an alley block. Then I go over to my friend's car and tell him what happened, and he said the dude was trying to get him to give him money for the smokes, and then he tried to get him to give him a ride at the ATM machine. 2 days later, there's a picture of the same guy on the local police department's Facebook asking for information on him because he's wanted in relation to armed robberies and burglaries. I guess I'll dive right into what happened and not bore you with the unimportant details. I was hiking on a trail I'm very familiar with, and because of changes in the weather, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. I wanted to try and get to my car before the downpour, and I knew this area like the back of my hand. Before I knew it, I felt very strange and disorientated. Nothing appears familiar. I'm not sure if the woods seemed to be silent before or after I felt this way, but I become undeniably aware of how silent everything is. Oppressingly down, really suffocating silence, and my heart begins to pound as I stood in place, and it felt as if the woods are spinning and closing in around me. I felt like I had nothing I could do, or anything that I could comprehend. It's when I start noticing something about 15 feet in front of me. Now, it was 10 feet high and 8 feet wide, and a distortion. It was like something was bending the light and moving towards me like a fogged up mirror, almost, but with no definitive shape. But it was moving with purpose and intelligence, and would be completely unnoticeable if not for the distortion. I turned to run and realised another was behind me, the same size and shape. Almost about then, I realised there's at least 4 more of these moving around me. I'm trapped. What I was seeing in my brain could not make sense, and I'm in utter shock and panic. I back up against a tree because I'm so scared. I curl up into a fetal position, pull my hands over my ears because they began ringing, and it's a deafening sound. I closed my eyes as these intelligent cloaked things moving around me. I saw a white flash like what happens if you've ever hit something very hard or been punched well. My ears were ringing and I see flashes, then nothing. I woke up to the rain falling on me. Hours have passed. Everything was normal and I knew where I was. I gather myself, check for injuries and realise I'm completely fine, and drive home. I can't make sense of what happened. I've googled similar events but not found anything like what happened to me. I stumbled across stealth cloaking technologies used by the military, and the technology is primitive compared to what I saw. And there was, I don't know, something very organic about what I saw. Now, I don't know if anyone's experienced something similar to me, but I need answers. Update. It's really hard to answer everyone individually, but I'm definitely going to be seeing the doctor tomorrow, but I have no history of seizures or other health issues. I'm in my 20s and fairly fit and sound of mind, but I want to make sure. Now, the headaches and blurry vision have only been an issue since the incident. I've never had migraines before, and these things had no definitive shape to them, and they were very large and moving with purpose and intelligence. Now I could smell something which I thought was my brain frying from how loud the sound was and how intense the situation was. Now I crouched down with my head in my hands, kneeling in the fetal position out of fear and panic before I blacked out. When I closed my eyes, I can see they're less than 5 feet away from me. I can smell a sulfuric metal type smell. Then the flash occurred that was blinding and I woke up afterwards. I was considerably dry even though it was drizzling when this occurred, and when I woke up, I realised 4 hours had passed and it was raining heavy, but I was pretty much dry and I can't explain it, but there was some sound during all of this. I won't lie, I'm shook up and freaked out. I'm trying to make a rational assumption out of what happened, but I really can't. I was coming home late from work one day. I worked as a forest ranger, so that means my hours could go pretty late sometimes. I had a pretty good day at work. Everything was normal. I got in and went to sleep. Now, just because I wasn't at work didn't mean I wasn't an outdoorsy person. So the next day, I decided to go for a hike in a forest not too far away from where I live. I really like getting out into the middle of nowhere because I find I can really free my mind this way and just think with a clear head. Now eventually I arrive at the forest. It's very peaceful now. I can hear all kinds of animals around. I put in my headphones and listen to some music and start my walk. As I'm walking, I start to get caught up on something that annoyed me, and I'm trying to find ways to think out of the situation. This goes on for a while, and I realise that I'm in a part of the woods I've never been in before. I'm kind of confused because as I look around, I see some mist and fog. I know that I must be near water because the mist is here, but I've never seen it before. As I'm doing so, I can see a dead tree just off in the distance. I don't know what it is about this, but I keep getting a really weird vibe. I look to the left and I can see a person standing up. I can only see the top of them. They must be wearing some strange camouflage or a Halloween suit because it looks like a skeleton staring at me. I think this is weird, and I decide to take off my headphones so I can be more in the situation in case anything goes bad. As I do so, I hear the sounds of bones crashing on the floor, almost like somebody's dropped a load of sticks onto concrete. Then it hits me. It's now completely silent where I am, and I look around and it's almost like I've gone to a complete different place. It doesn't look anything like the woods I was in before. I look up and I call out to the person thinking it's a hunter. They're not meant to be hunting here, and I really don't want to get shot today. They can't hear me, or they don't reply, so I decide to walk over slowly. I turn on my flashlight on my phone so they can see me coming. Again, I really don't want them to mistake me for an animal, but I have an orange coat on, so there shouldn't be a problem with that. I start explaining that I'm an off-duty park ranger and there's no problems here, just to let them know that I'm here. It's something I don't realise till afterwards, but it was completely silent in this moment, and the fog seems to be picking up. It was crazy thinking of it now. It was almost like I entered a movie scene of a strange limbo land where there's no heaven or earth or anything. You're just kind of in a barren wasteland. It's really creepy. I walk up towards where I last saw the person and I realise that they're long gone. But they've left something behind. I think it's a backpack, but I can't tell next to the sticks. As I approach, I get a horrible smell of sulphur. It's almost like a metallic smell. It's very hard to describe. I then see something on the ground that appears to be a large white rock, followed by other sticks. I'm very confused on exactly what this is. I turn it over using only my foot, and my heart drops. These are human remains. Not a fresh body by any chance. It looks like ancient bones, just sitting in a pile. My palms begin to sweat and it hits me that I saw this thing standing just a few seconds earlier before I looked down at my phone. In a heartbeat, I turn round and start sprinting in the opposite direction. The smell of sulphur still seems to be following me. I keep on sprinting through the woods and I don't even bother looking back. Through the grace of God, I find a path that I knew, which I never really travel along, and I keep on running for what felt like hours. I continue on this path and I glance back for a second and catch my breath. The craziest thing is I can't see any fog now, and the sound has all returned. Within less than a minute, I'm already sprinting back to my car, weeping as I'm driving back home. I haven't told this story to anyone, and I've never went back there again since. I have no idea what kind of limbo land I entered, or what that thing was. I just know that I never want to encounter it again. I'm staying in the Pigeon Forge near the Smoky Mountains right now, in a cabin in the woods. There's other cabins nearby though. I was deep asleep last night and my boyfriend was still outside in the hot tub, and he come inside yelling for me to wake up. He said that he started hearing something big moving around the forest. He thinks it's a bear, but he shines his flashlight, and it was like something small moving through the grass that he couldn't see clearly. There were multiple of them, but they were covered by grass and moving in different directions. He only saw one, but it was a little ways in the distance, and he described it as long and tan-coloured skin, slithering around, very fast but gracefully. They're clear as day, and he heard a woman scream saying, "Help me someone," but there's no one around, and it's the weirdest thing he'd sound like it's not a real person, like it's rehearsed or a recording. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. I have no idea what he saw. So for a bit of context, I live in northwestern Georgia, US. I'm in the middle of nowhere, on a weird off-on-its-own cul-de-sac with houses only on one side and the woods around it. Other than the cul-de-sac, houses are over 100 yards away from each other. The woods are thick, beginning about 30 foot away from our house. The area is not known to have any bears, no wolves or coyotes, and our coyotes are really small and shy, like the deer. I even contacted our local DFW and they said there's never been anything bigger than a coyote or wolf out here. I take the dogs out in the yard to pee about 2 to 3 times after dark. I put them on a split leash and normally wander around the yard for a bit to let them find a spot, but that's come to an end and I don't dare step off the patio now. For the past few weeks, my dogs have been acting really odd when it comes to going out at night. They want to go out front, but since my landlord doesn't want me to let them ruin the front lawn, I have to drag them to the back door, and they refuse to step out most times, especially my younger dog. They want to stay close to the house and are always very alert. They will lunge towards the woods at random, starting to bark like crazy. I would normally call this off as just wildlife, but it's been getting really weird. And normally, if there is something like a rabbit, they're very easily shushed and redirected. I've heard whatever it is walking right on the edge of the woods. It doesn't have the typical 4-beat walk of a 4-legged animal, and it's not scared of my dogs. I can hear its heavy breathing and the leaves crunch as it moves. It's not scared of dogs at all or me shouting, and it doesn't have to leave. It's always there by 9 PM. It'll be there at midnight, then it'll be there at 2 AM, always at the very edge of the woods, and I can feel a difference myself. Even when I go out alone, I had to grab a patio chair the other day for example. It's almost like I can feel when it's there. I'm normally very relaxed in my yard, even at night, but I'll get that back shuddering feeling that I have to get out of there. Now, my dogs go crazy when inside, seemingly at random, standing at the windows barking out to the woods. I've been out there during the day, looking for things like fur scraps, stag or claw marks, but nothing ever turns up, not even footprints. I've been trying to really find what this can be, but I always end up going in circles with this. As an immigrant, I'm not knowledgeable on local stuff like folklore, but I know this scares the holy hell out of me, so I'm wondering if anyone has an idea of what this could be. To lay the scene, I'm from a small town in Florida, very close to the coast. It's a commuter town, and it's usually pretty quiet at night, but since the state shut down, people haven't been so eager to get home and go to bed so they can get to work in the morning. But I work in the service, and still work just as much as though nothing had happened. I see a lot more people out at night having parties or driving around at weird hours. So one night, my dad picked me up from a closing shift. We decided to take the back roads to get back, because it's faster. It's still fairly inhabited, with houses and a church and a high school on the way, but it's poorly lit. It was an uneventful ride. We're just going like normal talking, catching up on the last hour or two of my day, until we made it to the final turn onto a stretch of road besides the church. In the middle of the road was a creature, and physically it's very large. It was covered in thick black fur, and for reference on the size, my dad drives a 2005 Dodge Ram. The headlights just reach his shoulders and it has skinny legs. It's hunched over and dragging one of them behind, and they curve outwards, which made me wonder if they're supposed to, or if it was severely bowed. I can't think logically of any animal it could have been, unless it was massively mutated or deformed, but it doesn't make sense. When our headlights hit it, it sunk to the ground, screamed and ran into the woods. The screams were high-pitched and wet, like it was gargling. I saw it stumble off the road and hit a tree before screaming again and disappearing. My dad stops the truck and gets out with a flashlight. We only stayed for a few minutes as we're both pretty shaken. We looked for blood or tracks, but there aren't any. But what I remembered is still how weird it was seeing the side of the road and the truck covered in white sand, even though we're not close to the beach. We got back in our truck and went home, and my dad refuses to talk about what we saw that day. I have no idea what I saw. Before I share my mum's experience, I feel like a little background into my family's history will be important. We're from a small town in Arizona. I was born there, but I lived in the city since I was 5 years old. My parents were born and raised there, as were their parents. The town has a slew of paranormal activity, maybe having something to do with it being an old outpost of some port for Spanish soldiers during the war. I don't honestly know which one. It was several hundreds of years ago. There are rumours of witchcraft, and many witches live in there even to this day. It has a cemetery on a hill that is so old, it's been condemned. You can literally fall through the ground and through an old coffin if you venture there, and the graves are so old that the remains are piles of rocks. There are no makers of any kind except for a few splintered across rotten wooded crosses. The house that my great-grandparents lived on was built sometime in between the mid-1800s. My mum grew up in the house next door. Many relics from the war have been discovered in this town, and when my mum was a preteen, she says her neighbours, who are extremely poor, discovered a chest of Spanish coins, both gold and silver, while digging a new septic tank. They become very wealthy overnight and moved away, but according to my mum, the family's still very well off. My family has somewhat of a dark history on my mum's side. After her grandparents both died, her mum was cleaning out their house when they discovered 2 voodoo-type dolls that they believed were responsible for her parents' deaths. That, however, is a story for another day. I'm just going to try and give you a bit of background info, and that was it. So, my mum's always been ultra sensitive. Her intuition is almost always spot on. She has spent her life hearing and seeing apparitions and spirits, even from a young age. She also dreams about all sorts. Some of them about people who have already died, some predicting death, other significant events in her life. She passed some of these traits on to me, and she says I am also sensitive based on my dreams and experiences. But that's another story for another day. She has told me several times of a dream that she had while spending the night at her grandparents' home. Now I'm retelling this by memory. She said that there was something significant about that day or night that she can remember. She was about 13 years old at the time. She went to bed around 9, which was normal, after helping clean up the kitchen after dinner. When she stayed there, she said she always slept in the guest bedroom, and since all her aunts moved away and had their own families, she's there all alone. The dream started as if she had just woken up in a strange place. She said that immediately, a pungent musty smell hit her nostrils, and it was so dark that she could hardly see her own hand in front of her. When she lifted her hand to look at it, she noticed the sounds of a chain rattling, and felt something cold and heavy on her wrists. After feeling them, she realizes these are thick shackles, and they're attached to the wall behind her, so her movement's limited. She said she started to feel the rest of her body, and said she didn't like it and didn't feel as though she was herself. She's extremely thin, can see her ribs sticking out, and she wasn't clothed. Her hair was cut very short and uneven, from what she could feel. Her face felt very thin too. Her cheekbones were sticking out. She noticed that she could faintly hear the sound of a man's voice and the sounds of horses, but it was far from where she was, It smelt dank and faintly like horse's manure. The floor was dirty. The floor felt hard like clay or concrete, and she started telling herself that it's just a dream. But she couldn't escape how real it felt. The smell, the sounds, the weight of the shackles and chains. About that time she started to hear some of the other chains rattling close by, as if there were others chained up around her. She could actually hear them cry and whimper, but not really understand words. At that point, a feeling of complete terror hit her, like she knew she could never escape or be rescued and would die there. She starts to look around and said she couldn't see anything besides or in front of her. But when she looked up, she could see there's a small window or opening about 2 feet by 2 feet, and it had 4 or 5 vertical bars on it. It must have been about 50 feet up from the floor, so there was no way she could reach it or look out of it. She realized that there were voices and the sounds of horses coming. She starts to panic and pulls at the chains, tugging at the shackles but to no avail. Neither would budge. She was trapped there with no way out. At this point she told herself that she had to be dreaming and tried everything she could to wake herself up. She bit her hands and pinched herself, even slapping herself, and nothing could wake her up. After what felt like hours, she sort of just bowed her head off and laid down crying to sleep. When she woke up, it's the next morning and the sun's shining. She woke up in bed, the same one she fell asleep in, at her grandparents' home. When she opened her eyes, her cheeks and pillow were wet with tears. Her heart was pounding out of her chest. She said that she still felt that horrible panic for several minutes after. She immediately got up and went to her grandparents' room. Now it's early, but they're already awake. She proceeded to tell them everything about the dream in detail. Her grandpa, whom she is very close to, hugged her to comfort her, reassuring her that she had a nightmare and everything's okay, and she just had a vivid imagination. She went home later and told her mum. She told her the same thing, it's her imagination. It took a few days to get over it, but she eventually forgets about the dream, and didn't even think about it until years later. As I mentioned before, my great-grandparents' house that they lived in and died in was really old. Growing up in it, it always needed some kind of repairs. The roof and the walls are always being worked on. My mum said she is pregnant with me when she's about 23, when the floor needed to be redone, and it's no easy job. The entire floor needed to be torn out. Now around this time, both of my grandparents had passed away. Her parents lived in the home. My uncle and a couple of cousins were skilled carpenters and they decided to do the job. My grandparents and my 2 uncles had moved out for about a week in order to get on with the repairs. This is the part that freaks me out to this day though. My grandma said the floor had never been redone up to this point, so she doesn't know when the original floor was made. What they did find, however, has remained a family secret for 40 years, but to this day nobody speaks of it. When the floor was completely torn out, my uncle expected to find dirt underneath. Instead, it looks like a boarded up cellar. It was empty, but there is nothing in the opening in the corner that resembled a shaft of sorts. The cellar floor was made of some type of old wood that's rotted, so they decided to tear it up as well. There wasn't dirt under the floor either, but another room. Apparently there's 4 floors underneath in total. All of them are pretty empty, besides some old saddles and horses' shoes, and some old wine bottles, that sort of thing. But on the very last level, deep underground, there was a room with a dirt floor, with shackles on the walls and some skeletons bound. There are actual bodies underneath the house. According to my mum, my uncles and cousins get really spooked, realizing what they've covered up. They don't want to disturb the bodies, so they build a new floor and don't even speak about it. When word reached my mum of what had been found, she immediately thinks of her dream. She knew what she experienced and that it must be linked to that. As for the house, it's still there. It is actually occupied by my grandma, well at least up until she passed, back in 2014. The property still belongs to the family, but The house has been condemned as the roof caved in a couple of years ago. All I know is that if ever who inherits a house tears it down, they're gonna be in for a really big surprise. My wife posted snippets of this story, but I'll explain it all. I lived in a small KY town throughout the middle of high school. That's as specific as I'll go. In this town, there was a large cemetery with a house on its land, and of course, my large family decided this is a perfect place. For reference, imagine a perfectly rectangled area. The entire right 2/3 are graves, maybe even more after that. The left third is condemned into a garage, with graves behind it and to the sides of it. In front of this garage is my house. An old house. This has been around for decades in terrible shape. It was cheap. Right away it's an unsettling home, with an added-on patio surrounded by windows that never felt empty day or night. This room had steps on the right that led to the basement, and the door in the front led to the main house. The entire house was freaky, and everyone often felt watched or followed. This actually happened all the time. Now to the basement, aka my living area. It was largely unfinished, just concrete all throughout. 1/3 of it are actually under the stairs, and there's a laundry/shower room. This was just a slab of concrete and a spray head, so let's just say it's horrid. There was a large main room where the patio steps connect to, allowing 2 entries and exits into the basement. It's important to know that in 3 years, the patio basement door was only used several times, usually by me sneaking out or something. There's only 2 small rooms with no doors connected to the main room, used for storage originally but turned into mine and my brother's rooms, even though he only stored things there and usually slept upstairs. Now, being a small child at the time, I didn't really think too much of this. The rooms are connected by a joint closet. My room was initially closed to the patio door on the far side of the room from the house stairs. I would spend the first half of the year in that room. This is the beginning of the terror I would experience. In this room, I used an old mint green bedsheet as a curtain, and it only took my first night to fully understand this place isn't normal. I would hear objects moving in the main room. The light from the shed that poured in from the ground level slit of a window would randomly be blocked with shadows. Whenever I left my room at night, I ran as hard as I can to get upstairs, dashing as fast as I can up the old wooden stairs, making as much noise as possible just to not hear it all behind me. I always felt watched, especially in the main room from my closet. I was about 15 at the time, so not an 8-year-old who's afraid of the dark, but I could feel eyes drilling into me, the malevolence of this main room, as I tore through the darkness to get upstairs. I slowly turned to sleeping less and less, waking up before my parents, pretending I dozed off on the couch to explain why I'm afraid of the basement. I never told them why until last year. Now, as terrifying and as unsettling as it is, my room felt, well, fine. Aside from the closet that connects to the other room, a closet I never opened unless I had to. It was fine. I wasn't disturbed in the room, and just left lights on whenever I could. However, after the first year, toxic mold pushed me from my room to what was originally my little brother's room, aka the place he left for a few things. It was here that the spookiness escalated to images and voices that haunted me for years later, still making me scream and wake up begging for help. My wife, who was dating me at the time I lived there, has said it's become normal to her to reach over and comfort me during this. Right away in the new room, things changed. No longer was I isolated in the corner of the basement. I'm dead center. The same curtain hung over the door frame, but the basement window light went right through it. I could see them, people of all types walking through my basement. Conversing silhouettes burned into my mind like a man in a large hat and suit, speaking to someone about the boy in there, always moving past my door. They knew I was there, they knew who I was, but they weren't my family or friends. I would on occasion try and get the strength to turn my light on and see what it was, to find no one, not a single person. I'd run upstairs and find everyone asleep. Tears rolled down my face as my body was shocked. I would stay upstairs until my folks woke up. It was here that the nightmares began, which would lead to sleep paralysis at times, terrifying enough on its own, but not inherently paranormal. The comfort I had was leaving Dragon Ball Z Seasons DVDs playing all night, 8 hours straight, never letting the room get dark. The spirits and shadows walking past my room become common, but not quite nightly. I was afraid but felt no danger. They left my room undisturbed while I was in it, seemingly respectfully to me. That's until it came. I awoke one night surrounded by darkness. The light from outside is dim. My eyes opened immediately as everything felt wrong. Then I saw it, a black mass leaning over me. Now this is small, no larger than me at least. It's the purest black I've ever seen. It was the shadow amongst shadows, darker than the night sky without stars. It was looking down at me almost playfully, but I could feel its hatred and anger. I closed my eyes, making certain that it wasn't just in my head or a dream. Now, my heart stopped for a moment. I can still see its eye, all these years later, piercing me. I had to make it leave. Nothing had violated my space before. I closed my eyes as tight as possible and jumped through it, slam on my light without skipping a beat, turning on the TV that I had, slamming on Dragon Ball Z as quick as I possibly can. My body shaking as I curled into a ball and just cried in the main room for several hours before the sun come up. This was the only time this creature made its presence known to me, but it still haunts me. I could feel that cold envelop me from time to time downstairs. The entire house was haunted. Objects would fall on their own and you'd hear footsteps constantly, but the base was my hell. Later last year, I told my siblings and parents what happened and asked if they felt something similar. Their stories weren't as graphic or as terrifying as mine, but they all experienced things in the basement. It's why my brother never slept there. My little sister wouldn't even go down there at all. 2 years later, the house was condemned, and I visited the now filled foundation where my room was. It was then that I really understood how I spent years sleeping on the same level, the exact same level as the bodies, surrounded on all sides, that I could feel this creature leaving the ground. It was terrifying me. I was glad it just wasn't watching me anymore. My wife was convinced for years that it attached itself to me, but that's for another day. I'm just glad it's gone now. For most of my childhood, I believed ghosts were real. The reason I believed was because of nightmares I had when I was younger. Nightmares that prevented me from going to the bathroom in the middle of the night, forcing me to sleep with a light on constantly, preventing me from looking down dark hallways and rooms on the way to bed. Truth be told, I didn't experience anything tangible to back my beliefs for a long time, yet I still believed the place was haunted. Fast forward to the age of 13, I moved to a new city into a much newer house. Nothing happened for several years, and my fears waned. I slept comfortable for years in one of the rooms upstairs. Life events happened. I was forced to switch rooms several times. I moved to another room upstairs across the hall and back again to my original room. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing could have prepared me for the next move to the middle of the wide open basement. It started in high school at about 10th grade. I slept underneath a window. Seating area, TV, bathroom, another bedroom were across to my left. A storage space was at the foot of my bed, 2 giant bookcases with a curtain between them, with a fridge and family heirlooms behind them. Now one early morning, I had my first experience. Now at 6 a.m, my alarm was set to kill a queen. I was awoken to the song. When I sat up to my best friend, who was dressed as Freddie Mercury at Live Aid, standing at the foot of my bedroom door singing. Only for a brief moment, I blinked and he's gone. The alarm went off. I laugh about it. Nothing too strange for several weeks occurred after. Another night, I was awoken to a chill. I opened my eyes to the dark basement. My eyes pan to the left, and I see a tall, black, shadowy figure quietly floating across the room, passing about 5 feet away from me parallel to the bedside before disappearing behind the bookcase. It was hauntingly peaceful and quiet. It didn't appear to notice me, but the image was so vivid. It didn't actually scare me, and I slept peacefully after. But whatever was trying to communicate with me saved its most disturbing and sinister for last. Several months later, my room orientation changed. I now slept where the seating area was facing the window I slept underneath. The black shadow now wouldn't move from left to right, instead right to left. It was December and I wasn't feeling great, and I go to bed at 8. I was in a state of sleep that you're just about aware of what's going on, but you kind of feel asleep, like an in-between. Something tells me to sit up. I turned over and sat up, and I see a moonlight white, decomposing face with hollowed out eyes about 12 inches away from me, its face contorting, rotting and disfigured. It was in a crawling position, staring at me. My eyes dart left, and 3 more sat to the couch to the left of me, one with its legs crossed, all facing me, disfigured. This only lasted for a few seconds. I closed my eyes a few times and they were gone. I curled up into the corner against the wall, panicked, fumbled for the TV remote in the dark and turned that on for some light, and I don't sleep for 3 days. When I went back, I never slept comfortably, and I never saw anything like it since. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me in my life was a week ago, and caused me to move out of the house I was renting. Now this house I was renting was ancient. It must have been at least 100 years old. It had a creepy basement that I never went into. Well, never unless I had to. I stayed there happily with my wife, but she was away for work during this time. Now a week ago, everything's going well, and I'm peacefully asleep in my bedroom when I hear somebody calling out my voice from the basement. It's my wife's voice. I'm very confused, but think she's come back and is in some kind of danger in my confusion, so I get up quickly to head down there. I have my flashlight, and I'm not kidding. The moment I put my flashlight there, I can't even see the bottom of the stairs. This doesn't make sense because I have my torch on, but it's almost like I've hit a wall of blackness. My flashlight flickers off and I hear the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. I drop the torch and immediately bolt it out of there. I quickly pack up some vital necessities, jump into my car, then drive for 3 hours to get to my parents' house. I never went back to that place again. Later in that same day, I get a phone call off of my neighbour asking if I was okay because she heard a blood-curdling scream coming from my house and could see a figure at the very top in the attic. This occurred to my brother. My house was built in 1904. It's a single family home, wooden frames sitting on a concrete block foundation. I've been living there for about 18 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and me have seen or heard, is all down to this one event, and is very vivid. About 15 years ago, my brother and his best friends had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, alternative music but in a Spanish language. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice in the evening, and they would usually call it quits by about 8 PM. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed because I worked the graveyard shift. I usually only slept for a few hours before heading to work. This event happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter. They had just finished a long session when deciding to head to someone else's house came about. My brother headed to his car keys and gives them to his buddy so they can load up all their equipment. Everyone filed out of the basement. The tricky part was that they needed to walk all the way back to the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen, down the hall, into the living room, and out into the front where there's a porch. Everyone's outside sitting in my brother's truck waiting for him. My brother was walking up the stairs when he remembered that he left food in a container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back. Now the basement is not clean. Now the basement itself is full of sight lines. There have been partitions made. The boiler and the main heating unit are right smack bang in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he's about to retrieve his food container when out of the corner of his eye, he sees it. A shadowy figure right at his peripheral vision. The feeling of dread and uneasiness washes over my brother. We had been taught that if you're in the presence of a spirit or a ghost or you get a bad vibe, to very quickly pray or cuss at it. My brother chose the latter and basically swore at it. My brother turns around, not glancing in the dark corner. He starts to walk back towards the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch is on the opposite side of the front door. Now luckily the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding in the living room with its amber glow. My brother said he felt something at his back just as he walked out the house, but at no point did he want to turn around as he flickered the last switch in the living room and it goes dark. As he stepped out, he pulled onto the door, closing it behind him. He's still holding his canned food container in one hand. He jogged down the few porch steps, walks towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no back garden. As he gets close to the gap between himself and his friend, he kind of smiled as he thought everything was over, and he's annoyed that he's scared of nothing, thinking it's in his head. He then climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house when one of his friends says, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming in with us?" My brother answers, "What do you mean? He went to work earlier in the night. He's already gone." "Do you not see his car?" They all stared at him with disbelief, saying, "Then who was walking behind you then?" Hello everyone, hope you're all doing great. Thank you again for all the kind comments on my last video and on my Instagram. I wanted to say, remember, if you struggle with mental health problems, make sure that you have a good structure in your life. It doesn't sound like much, but it's extremely important for me to stay good and to get everything done and not worry as much. It hasn't got to be the most overstructured thing in the world or too complicated, but just make sure that you have some kind of routine. Like, it'll really do a lot of good for your head, honestly. The worst I get is when I don't have goals or structure, but having them simple things can make the world's difference, so just remember that. I hope you enjoy these stories. I love you, and I'll talk to you all soon. And make sure you check out the podcast below and my Instagram, which is at Joe the Insomniac. So I live in a somewhat medium-sized town with a mix of cities and backwoods areas. A bus stop I usually use is a good mix. It has buildings close by, while also having entry says into the nearby surrounding buildings. One morning, I was waiting in the middle of nowhere for the bus. I realise how late it is in the morning. I get annoyed and decide since I was bored, I would go into this little walkway/trail that's nearby. Not all the way, just enough to where I could be secluded by the trees. After a while of checking my phone, I hear the bus stopping a little way from me. I head back to see if it's there, and I get a fight or flight response that was very intense. It's like a gunshot. I turn around to see this crouching creature coming out of the secluded area that I was in. It was pitch black. Its arms were about the size of its body. Its head looked like it was an eraser that's used. The most terrifying part of the creature is its size. It's easily the size of a telephone pole. It towered over me, and everything around it. Its hands were large and its fingers were thick, and were about half the size of my arm. I don't know if I should run because I know this thing could catch me easily. Some time passed while it climbed out of the walkway and just stood looking at me. Then the bus pulled up, opens its doors. I look at the bus and back to the creature, but I can't see it now. I look at the bus driver and his face is normal, so I assume that he hasn't seen it. I got on the bus and cried silently for a good 5 minutes. I don't know if this correlated or if it's just my brain, but that night I had a dream of the exact same thing that happened to me. Except the bus doesn't show up and my limbs get ripped off. My friends don't believe me about it. I don't know whether I saw a skinwalker or what, but I hate the fact that the bus driver didn't see it too. I have no idea what it was to this day, and I still get very scared if I go back to that bus stop or I'm near the forest line where this thing come from. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent, and there's a guy sitting by where I am with my fire, and right beside the tent. Nothing in particular is noteworthy about the situation now or the guy. It's just a regular guy sitting outside where I am, a couple of feet away from my tent. But he's got no pack or anything with him, just a guy there. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge, like he just saw a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and somebody probably off his head or something. And maybe it's a coincidence he's near me and he got lost going back to his campsite. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that got more and more convincing that a person's there. I call out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get the bell crown?" I said no. I didn't even think it was a real thing. They kept talking just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and that kind of spooks me. After like 15 minutes of being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light again, and it was the same dude who'd been outside the night before. He had to have followed me for almost 15 miles in 2 days, this means. It's not an accident. No way, it's impossible. And as soon as my light hits him, he takes off again. I start to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the darkness, so stopped quickly after probably 100 or 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off now. because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following. I decided the trip was very, very unsettling and hiked back over the next 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw off anybody from following me. I occasionally hide and see if anyone's there. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I'm being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do best to avoid potentially being murdered on. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walk in circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, no one's there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises in the distance, but slowly decided that it sounds more human. It could have been somebody pretending to be an animal though, but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I almost cried when I finally got back to the car, because the feeling of relief was so strong. To this day, I have literally no idea who this person is or why they were following me, and I don't understand how they were surviving fine without any backpack or tent. That's what scares me the most. They must have been out there for a while. I hate to think what would have happened if I fell asleep with them around. I live in a small town in Kentucky, and I've lived there for my entire life, and because of that, I've been surrounded by the mountains and woods for years. My house is currently nestled into the woods in the middle of nowhere, and thus, outdoor activities has taken up a massive chunk of my life, especially in the summer and fall. I'm in the woods almost daily, hiking to the creeks to fish or meadows to hunt. I know the woods and trails around my home like the back of my hand. That said, there is definitely something that calls to you while you're out in the woods, especially when you're alone, and I've just realised now that, after stumbling upon these subs, that it's something I probably shouldn't have brushed off, but it's hard to ignore. My parents began allowing me to hike alone when I was around 13, but I didn't get really into it until about 2 years later when I'm 15. Even then though, I wasn't allowed to go far and always had a walkie-talkie. Later at 17, I'm allowed to have a handgun with me, but that's neither here nor there. There's stories I can tell at that age too, but this one happened when I was 15. Before I get into it, I should mention that I have 2 dogs outside, Max a black lab and Bo a beagle. I've had both since I was young, and they're smart, always staying by my side when I'm in the woods. They always listen to me, until this day. I'm hiking a trail that runs up beyond my aunt's house, one that I'd hike in and out of during the day. Now I just get out to enjoy the woods there really. It was in October, so the weather was cool and hot, and I'd been hiking for about an hour. The trail comes out on a spring that runs down from the top of this particular mountain. It hadn't rained that day, so the spring was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I remember looking up the mountains, which I'd never liked to hike to the top of before, but I had this strange call. It wasn't really a voice, but an urge that I can't ignore. Keep in mind that I'm a very timid person, and hiking unfamiliar trails on my own freaks me out to this day, but that day, all my fear had dissipated. I begin hiking higher and higher. My dogs are following. I don't even know how to describe the feeling that came over me, but I just remembered staring down at my feet and feeling at peace as I climbed. There's a moment when I stopped to look out at the houses below. I'd never been so high up. Remember, I felt amazed. I took a picture on my phone, and then I look around me for my dogs. Both had already run off and Max was following. I called out to them frantically to stop, but they don't listen. They disappear. At this point, looking down at the mountainside, I'm very afraid. Then I look back uphill, and it came over me again. I keep hiking. I can't stop. Eventually, I heard my walkie-talkie crackle. Everything was distorted, and I couldn't make out any words. I assume now I was just out of range to pick it up. But back then, it freaks me out. Whatever come over me had now stopped. My dogs were still gone. Panicked, I began running downhill. It's a wonder I don't get hurt. As I near the wide section of the spring near the bottom, my walkie-talkie picks back up, and I heard my dogs running downhill behind me. I gone home, and mostly forgotten about it. I just told myself that I'd been lost and to be more careful. Now fast forward many years to now. I still hike. I commented the short version of this before, but saying I'd add more, and there is more. So last year, I hike up to a cave behind my house. This is something that I've done a million times before, and then I started following a trail that I'd never fully explored, just out of curiosity. Bo was ahead of me as per usual, but when I call back to her, she comes. We hiked for the better part of 45 minutes, following a pretty simple trail, and then I figured out I'd better be heading back because it'd be getting dark soon. And yet I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself I'd go for a little bit further and a bit more. I remembered looking down at my feet, just like before, and listening to the silence of the woods around me, and feeling at peace. It felt so easy just to go deeper, and so difficult to turn around. Bo felt the call too, because even after that, I did break out of it and turn around. And then called her back, and she wouldn't stop. I had to catch up with her and physically turn her around and pet her before she'd come with me. Now these stories really worried me. What if I didn't stumble? What if my mum hadn't decided to contact me at that moment? How deep would I have hiked, and what would have waited for me in the depths? I don't know what's out there, but I do know this. The woods definitely called me. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved to pretend that we were frontiermen. We built shelters, traps, practiced making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was actually based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little way off the track. Of course we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we're kids. We had a lot of fun. We'd find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. I loved doing this. It was so fun we do it multiple times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went on our own ways. We both left home but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. But one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe were talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix, so we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention that to us. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd go the opposite way, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell and we set off. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but all in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoking, and then moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before the night set in, we picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the track, so you felt like you're in a tunnel. We had brought the small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting on the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area, go around a little, and make sure some dude's house wasn't just over the hill, and we're not just on their yard. We'd walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods, up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of the short hill, we'd be okay. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, just barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed that it was a sugar shack or something, but there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in there either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly. As we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all, instead an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building, and the wooden planks are almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on the top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a build-up section in the front the preacher would stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anybody else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot that we had picked to camp at. Having a hill between us, we felt a lot safer, but we're still on edge. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk and we decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. Night set in. As we lay in our hammocks, we start talking, and we begin to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "You hear that? What the hell? It sounds like someone singing." And at this point, we both slid right out of our hammocks, hunkered down, starting to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we moved back up the hill to spy from where they are. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. The moon was barely out, but provided enough light for us to walk there. We don't use flashlights because obviously we don't want to be seen. It's coming from the church and the singing's coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and heard a conversation. It sounded like they were talking in tongues almost. The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickers, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung exactly. It sounded like church music, but another version in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer either. We're about a football field length away now. The singing continued and then stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the life out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you'd see in movies, but they were speaking a different language and we can't get a word of it. Eventually it got to where the male single voice would say something, then another lot would answer in song. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into this long sustained wow that just kept getting louder, and it's so disturbing. At this point, I was getting ready to say, "Let's get out of there," but Joe says, "Hey, they're coming." and we get far enough away that we could really make them out well. But what we could see was a line of people seemingly coming straight towards us, still singing. We book it down the hill to our campsite, grab our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them is shaking. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we can, eventually seeing the lights and the end of the road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it. As we walk there, we get to a 24-hour gas station and call my wife to get us. My wife and other friends all just think it's kids messing around, but we sure as hell know there weren't kids singing like that. We're not sure who those people were, but it's definitely the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was 19, I used to love going for early morning runs alone in the woods outside my college campus. I never saw another person on my trail, and I really enjoyed the silence in the early morning. However, one day, I was feeling unwell and decided to stop about halfway in. I was relatively close to the outskirts of the woods. I kneel over and got sick. I then hear snapping and crunching behind me and turn and see a guy running right towards me in all black, seemingly out of nowhere. He's definitely not out for an early morning jog like me. I can't describe the feeling of dread that washed over me as he silently quickens his pace towards me. I pulled myself together and ran out there as fast as possible. I ran my first and only 6-minute mile that day and never went to go in them woods again. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town I lived in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours away from any major city. For context, this forest had quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they'd go there often, having a lot of superstitions about being safe there and what you need to do. I just broke up with my partner and my roommate could sense I'm down. Finals are around the corner, so she decides to help me get out of my mind and suggests we go to a few spots there that she's found and just chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road into the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground that the road is on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing and parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started just talking, playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared on the road and parked in the clearing. My friend doesn't pay attention to them. Instead, she keeps talking, but I was facing them from where I sat, and I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of the car, another does too, and they talk, and then I saw them take out a long object covering dark plastic bags from the back of the car. This is when I noticed one of them has a gun, not like a shotgun either. They then start lighting the bag on fire. I tell my friend to get down. She turned around and saw them for the first time, black smoke rising from the bags, and between them, trying to keep my head down and still glances as I saw them take out another object. I heard them shoot at it before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were laying there in silence, but definitely long enough to let the terror sink in. At this point, I look up and saw they're pointing at our car and they start walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or find us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend jump into the driver's seat, and we gotta make a run for it. I shut the back door between that and the car starting up. The guys hear this and actually start sprinting towards us. We went over a hill and drive as far as we can to try and get safe, then into the neighbouring town and roamed around for a while, just making sure we're not being followed. That day, we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got drunk, but started crying because we saw something we shouldn't have, and we were in grave danger. I honestly don't know how to explain this strange handwritten letter I received last week. For my backstory, my family and I have been staying with my parents for 3 months because I've had some health problems. We didn't tell a lot of people because we were still in the same town and everyone was sheltering in place anyway. Last month, my mum told me I had received a letter in the mail and I could tell by her voice she was irritated and intrigued. It was strange that there was even mail there because I've only been there for a couple years. It was never the permanent home, and I hadn't been there for long. I head downstairs and she hands me a letter, addressed to me but using my maiden name. I've been married over 10 years and my name is now distinctly different. The return address is from Patty C. I don't know anyone by the name. Now to reiterate, my parents don't actually own this home, so we're obviously very interested to see the contents of the envelope. But I open it and unfold a handwritten letter. Well, it's a note on a 9.5 by 11 ruled notebook paper. The letter is very personal, so I won't write it out, but it goes into detail about my health and how this person cares deeply and is praying for me. She writes as though we're best friends. At the bottom it's signed with PS to call her any time. Now my mum and I are so incredibly confused and concerned about this person, and I decide to call the number, and a woman picks up and I ask for Patty C. The woman pauses and sighs and explains that her mother, Patty C, died 1.5 years ago. I immediately apologise, about to hang up. More bewildered than ever when this woman asks why I'm calling for her mother on her cell phone. I'm not sure what to say and stumble through an explanation about receiving a letter. Kim is silent for a while, then says she's only had this cell number for 6 months. Well, after her mother's passing, I apologise again and say there must have been a mistake. My mum and I decide to Google the address and it's a small public park in town. I'm so confused by this, like honestly, I have no idea what this could be or what it means. Back in the late 80s, I was in college and lived in a dorm room. I never owned an Ouija board, but if someone had one, I'd either watch or participate. To be honest, this was one of the first times I used one. I had a question for the board. My grandmother had my father when she was young and single. That was a big deal in the late 1930s. When she found out she's pregnant, she ran away from home, dropped my father off at her parents' house when he was 6 months old and left, coming to visit less and less frequently. By the time he was 5, she never come back at all and disappeared. So my father was raised by an aunt, never really knew his mother, and didn't have any idea who his father was. By the time he's in his late 40s, he wanted to find her. Lots of dead ends, and this was frustrating. Anyway, that night, I asked the board if my grandmother's alive and it said yes. I asked if she lives in my home state, the board said yes. I asked if she lived in my hometown and it said yes. I say what street she lived on. It spelled out the name of a street. I'll just call it Washington Street. The real name was very uncommon. Now at the time, I wasn't really sure if there was a Washington Street in my hometown. Turns out there was. No, Grandma didn't live there, but 2 years later, my father found his mum. She lived in my home state, in the town of Washington. It wasn't the street name, it was the town name. But how messed up is that? More than 30 years later, I still have no explanation for this. Hey everyone, this story is long and requires a lot of context, but be patient because it's worth it. I created this count to really talk about a couple of things that I've been through in the last 2 years because frankly, I've started to forget some of my older experiences from new ones piling up. Chronologically, this is like my 8th or 9th one now, and I want to share it. This story takes place at a cabin in Vermont. 1 room, 16 by 16, lofted area, wood stove for heat, no running water, attachment with a compositing toilet pretty far away, nestled into a dirt road off a dirt road. Both are from former login roads. Now, my girlfriend found the place on CL and wanted to move into it together because, in lieu of rent, we could provide 8 hours of labour a week to the landlord. I like the adventure and wild settings, and I was nervous that if she went in without me, she's going to be over her head. The backstory on the cabin is that it was built by a man, initials DC, in the mid-70s. DC suffered from schizophrenia and lived in the cabin while renting out another cabin for some property income. Somewhere along the lines, he had a couple renting his property who couldn't actually pay and wouldn't move out, and it upsets him. While they were gone, he burned their home to the ground. In the fallout, their relationship ended and they drifted away. DC built another cabin, a shack really, which is 2 4x8 rooms with a 7-foot ceiling adjacent to the rubble, and moves in. I assumed that was so he could rent out the larger cabin, but no one I spoke to about it could actually confirm so. Most of the history comes from the landlord who briefly knew DC, and a college friend of his who lives on the mountain in a shack made out of some tarps and plastic with a propane cooking stove for heat. Now he's a dear humble man and beautiful artist who did not like talking to strangers, but he and I connect over the love of nature and our willingness to get the aesthetic in the pursuit of freedom. The shack stands on the property, but the roof is full of holes and is terribly rotten. It is frankly questionable how a structure as unsound as this stays up, but it does. The shack overlooks the cabin and can be seen looking out from the bathroom window and the southwest window in the main cabin. It was unearthly to see in the moonlight. This story takes place on November 18th of last year, roughly 2 weeks after my girlfriend and I had moved in. Kay's my girlfriend, well I'm just going to call her that for this. Kay had some problems, and still does. I loved her dearly, though, and at this point in time we were inseparable. The day started normally. She went to work and I stayed home, gave the dog a bath. A statty stopped by looking for her, second time she was out, and delivered a card. I texted her a photo and told her to get in touch without thinking, and that sets her off. I had to go to work, so I sent her a message that said I trusted her and would see her later. I went to work with the landlord, a mean old POS of the bad yogi variety, and left my phone in my coat. We were bucking logs and splitting wood, which was warm work that day, as the old saying goes, so I tossed my coat to the side. I don't hear my phone ring. When we're done splitting wood, he needed my help to drop off a car for his repair. He needed my help because he doesn't have friends and the place we're going was at some random rustic shop, because he thought he could make the guy work for extra cheap. On the way back, I finally took a look at my phone, and there's one message you never ever want to see, a suicidal note. We got back to the mountain and I'm at a loss. My car had been sitting since the day I brought it over because the battery is dead. It had no gas in it because I forgot my wallet. The last time I drove it, to her and the car, the reliable one. So that's wherever she is and she won't answer my text messages. I try calling her relatives but no luck. So I mentioned the predicament to the landlord. and he cracks a joke that she's already gone, before covering up with a very hollow, it's usually nothing. He says, I can have a half-gallon of gas from a gas can and he'll give me a jump, but that's it. I honestly don't care, because it was enough to get me moving. I'm in no mood for jokes. So I set out. Jumper cable was in the passenger seat, $3 in my pocket for gas. Literally all I had at this point, because you don't work for rent if you're flush with cash. I white-knuckled it to town, praying with my soul that she's alright. I drove all the way over to the spots with no luck, and went to the bar where her sister works to try and find her. She wasn't working, so I gave the bartender my number and say to reach out if he sees her and that it's urgent. Then I went to Kay's work and asked how she was when she left. Her employer told me that she left bitterly, swearing that she was going to end it, but she hadn't done anything because it didn't seem important. Now I'll let that sit there for a moment. Then a glimmer of hope. Her sister had heard from her, a single text message with the letter S. After roughly 5 hours up against it, we knew she was still breathing. You can't imagine the relief I felt, so I went home to wait, kept on texting her encouragement. Night fell, and I was in the cabin alone waiting. I'm a little bit of a poet, so I finally sent this poem. Sweet baby girl, out on your own. Who knows the way that you're going to be guided back home? We love you, we miss you. Our beating hearts have flown out from our cheeks to seek our missing one. She then came home, half an hour later, staggering through the door, falling into my arms, sobbing. She said that she had stopped there 3 times on her way up to the mountain because she didn't have the strength to return. I asked her how she was, and she said she felt heavy and cold, like she'd fallen down a dark hole. She said she couldn't find her way out, that she lost the light. I specifically remember her saying she felt like something was trying to swallow her and wouldn't let go. Then she looks at me and says she thought that something from the cabin or mountain was attacking her through the Ouija board. At this point, I felt thoroughly fed up against it. Her Ouija board is over 100 years old, one of the original ones made out of a single piece of wood. I had seen it once or twice and didn't like it much, because my background is kind of Christian, and it strongly believes in the existence of demons and spirits. Now, depending on who you ask, an Ouija board is like a direct door to hell. Her board is stored in a closet under the cabin, reachable only by steep dirt paths, tucked in any one of a random assortment of boxes. The last time that Kay went down there, she very nearly fell onto a pair of scissors. To put it bluntly, there were bad vibes and they're strong, so I told her I would deal with it if she agreed to follow my orders until we were done. She was nearly dead on her feet and agreed. The first thing I did was climb into the loft and got my crucifix. It was a gift from a man I met walking my dog, passed down to him from his German grandmother, who had blessed it by a Catholic priest. I have another story about the crucifix, but it's not for today. I sit her on the couch and hand her the crucifix, with the order to hold it in front of her and not say anything. My father is a pastor. My mother is a devote, so I called them. I told my mum the situation, and she said, "You can't exercise a board because it's inherently evil," to which I replied, "I know, but I can drive away anything coming through it and bind its power." I tell her to pray for me for my protection and success, and she said she would. I cleared my desk so I had a place to put the board when I get back, laid my Bible on it to be ready to hand. I put on my coat and look at the front door. I didn't want to go out. I can't tell you how much I did not want to. The board made me feel uncomfortable on a good day. Now I had to go to find it in the closet in the dark by myself with full knowledge that it's trying to kill my girlfriend. I put on a crappy headlamp, muster my courage and step out. It was dark, there was a slight breeze, and the area felt heavy. Imagine the feeling of resistance of walking into a heavy wind, but without the wind to justify the intensity. Now, I shuffled down the embankment to the closet, took a deep, deep breath and opened the door. The headlamp only lit half the space, and I didn't enjoy that. Fortunately for me, the board was in the first box I opened. We kept it wrapped up in a purple piece of wool with moon and stars on it, that I got from the man who gave me the crucifix. With the intention of keeping it, both tucked away and relatively spaced away from everything. Now unfortunately for me, it's half unwrapped, and the naked board is hanging out in the cold. I picked it up by the covered part and wrapped it up. I took one step and something happened. I say something because it felt like I stumbled, but I didn't. I was anticipating and don't want to drop the board, so I was moving very slow, but I put my foot down and had to brace myself and keep from falling over. The second step was much the same, and I can't really describe it because I didn't feel a hand or a shove, and my feet didn't slip or slide, but my balance was all over. I carefully climbed up the embankment, went back in, and set the board in the spot I'd made for it. I unwrapped the board, placed my Bible directly between me and it. I sat down, put my hands flat on my desk, and wait for it. I cast out the evil. I bound out the board with the most powerful, clear, distinct language I can. Dealing with an evil spirit is like a wish of a genie, and you really don't want to leave loops. As soon as I stop speaking, the heavy feeling that had been lingering over me vanishes. I wrapped the board up and asked Kay if it worked. She smiles and nodded, and said that she could see the light again and was feeling better. Now there's one last wrinkle I wanted to leave you with, and I swear this is true. The night before that all happened, I had a dream that I ran out onto a pier into the ocean through fierce winds, crashing waves to get to Kay. I carried her back as storm winds howled and tried to get us back out of the sea. When we made it to land and looked for shelter, I opened the door in a pillar and thrust her ahead of me. Then I went in and found the room full of people in historical garb, some 1920s era, some earlier. I want to say there were 12 or 13, but it was a dream, so I can't remember. I do remember a little boy, newsy style, with a thick blood coming down from under his cap and a very haunting look in his eye. I opened the door and pulled us both from the room, and that's when I woke up. Here's how my mother tells it. It's 1979, when my mother was 15 or 16. A larger group of my extended family are gathered in my grandma's house in rural Iowa, where most of them lived. They were there to discuss what was to be done with my recently deceased grandmother's house. You see, my great-grandmother hated the house, and so, in the final 6 months of her life, had built another house on the same plot of land, which I guess wasn't in accordance with the state's plot laws. As any logical thinker would do, they decided to ask my great-grandmother herself. A Ouija board in hand, the female members of the family walked out into the night to do their seance, which was just down the dirt road from where they were. The house was built in the mid-19th century, had 6 bedrooms, was huge from what I can gather. However, it doesn't have electricity, so they brought candles to light the space. About half of the women were there in attendance and are believers, with the other half being skeptics. This leads to some frustration with the asking of questions to the Ouija board. However, sometime in the night, the energy of the house totally changes. One of my aunts asks if Margaret was there, and they don't get a response from the board. Instead, a piece of tinsel on the doorway starts to swing as though it's a pendulum. It would be easy to say it was the wind or atmospheric pressure that could have accounted for the change. However, keep in mind it's a large house and the room surrounding the central living room acted as a wind block. It's also worthwhile to point out that the candles at this point flickered or went out. The movement continues with every question. back and forth like a pendulum. Finally, someone asked what was to be done with the house. The tinsel stopped moving altogether and began moving violently in the opposite direction. The tinsel stopped responding after that question, so they moved back to the Ouija board. No sooner had they done this when it spelled out a very cryptic message: BURNIT. They then sprint out of there and call the volunteer fire department. About 7 years ago, my wife and I were on a road trip driving past a provincial park in NW, Ontario, after its official closure from the season, and decided to drop in and spend a few hours having a picnic lunch by a lake. The park was totally deserted with the ranger/check station closed, but the park gate opened, and unmanned we drive past and drove down the roads to the campgrounds a few miles in. She had to use the washroom, so I pull up to a group of outhouses that are there for the campers. I park about 20 feet away and sat in the truck staring at the woods while she went into one of them. It was a sunny, quiet, peaceful day. Then after a few minutes, she came back into the truck, slams the door and shouts at me, "What is your problem?" I'm shocked and said, "What are you talking about?" And she says, "There's 3 outhouses. Could you have used one of them instead of trying to get to mine?" I said, "What?" She said, "Almost the whole time I was in there, you kept rattling and pulling the door trying to get in. I thought you were trying to break it." I told her that I didn't know what she was talking about. I said, "What the hell? I was here the whole time. There was no way I was there. You would have heard the truck open." We then went quiet and stared at each other, realizing just how quiet it is. I snap out of it and gun the truck out of there, and we never came back to that park. I wouldn't even go within 100 miles of it. This happened 2 years ago, and since the anniversary just passed, I thought I should finally share my story. My fiance and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about half an hour from where I lived. Now, we live in a predominantly white, conservative and racist area. That part is important, and my husband is black. On our first night, we keep hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside our one to the right is occupied, but the one to our left is not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the exact same plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that lived in the woods. The first night we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obvious something large had moved around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now back to the main event. On August 11, we spent the day at the battlefields, a town over, with my family. They'd all been invited to join us for the day, but my fiance, as a surprise for me, proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening, at about 6 p.m, before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets were thrown around and clothes were on the floor, backpack being rearranged, but hey, we were stupid 19-year-olds and decided that since whoever had busted in hadn't taken anything, everything's fine. We set up a campfire and sat out until it's dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m, we put out the fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Now, we immediately hear noises outside of the tent again, but this time we focus in. We heard clear footsteps at this point, a man whispering. We look at each other with our eyes wide. Someone was definitely walking around our tent. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps we heard whispering again. There's 2 men around there. As if we had the ability to read minds, my fiancé said I have to go to the bathroom, and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who are in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now, here's the part where I get chills. We got up and were getting dressed, and my fiancé just turned on a light in our tent, put his blinder on when a man spoke directly in front of us saying, "What are you doing?" I can't even describe how malicious and menacing his voice sounds. It was clearly directed at us. He said it with a horrible tone. He was watching us through the tent. Again, because we're stupid, we decided to just go and run to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and keys and stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell to the car. I heard footsteps running behind us, and then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talk over our options. We talk about sleeping in the car or driving to another town. Then, we have another idea. We drive back down to our campsite and begin packing up everything to the car. It was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us actually could be able to, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it, grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive and grabbed our nameplate. As we pulled out of the campsite, I realised we can finally see the assailants. Stalking through the woods onto our campsite were tall white men. I realised they were the same men that had been driving past the campsite the whole time, just glaring at us, muttering. One was wearing camo hunting gear, the other had a Confederate flag tank top, both carrying hunting knives. They have them in a way that they're ready to attack. They turned when they saw our car, and one started to make chase until the other stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiles the most terrifying smile I have ever seen in my life. He just shakes his head slowly as we got away. We drove the long way home. We're taking the hardest roads back. When we got home, we told my dad everything and he shrugs it off as us being paranoid. So I never told anybody else really. I am convinced to this day that it was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground's not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at the campsites. It was no accident that the two men had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck. I still get chills when I think about it and how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky it was that our reckless plan had actually worked to get out of there. This was truly the scariest, most horrible thing that's ever happened to me. I've never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I don't know who this man was or what he was trying to do, or if he's still where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how truly secluded I was when this happened, how badly it could have ended if it weren't for my parents. So I was back for the summer for the first time after starting university. Our home was, or still is, just outside of a small town with forest all around. There's also a small lake by it, which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ran into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path which led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through the dense trees to make the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path which turns northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn west after a few miles, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water, it goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. I never saw anybody else there. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path from the stream to the sharp bend, then cutting into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands through the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring frequently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondering if it was a lost dog or something, and start moving towards the sound. I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyway, so what the hell. I realised it could have been an animal. I could tell the bell was heavy. I don't think it's an animal now, because it's so clear that it's not on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. It then completely stops. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something. The river was too fast still. I thought of everything, but nothing could explain the sound apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to be a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally. Until I found a badger, one that was dead. It was laying weirdly, and it wasn't as though an animal had attacked it. The smell was really bad too. Now the sound of the bell had been following the stream, so had I, and the badger was put there. Maybe it even died there. It was really weird. Now nothing else happens that day. Now 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer and last time ever. I left home at around 6 PM. I made it to the stream, then walk into the river. It's an hour, and then decide to go back the way I came because it's getting late and it was raining heavily. The sun set around 9 PM. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain and the trees seemed surreal and loud. I knew that somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open parts of the forest might not have been the best idea when I bumped into something quite heavy. The smell was horrible, and there's another badger. It's just not natural how it's been placed there from a tree. It looks like it's a load of blocks put together. I gagged. As I walked into it, fluid fell on me. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, gobsmacked. What animal could do this? I was soaked in rain, and my senses are overwhelmed yet confused. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been thrown over me when I realised that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had put it up there after I passed it, knowing I'd see it. So, someone was watching me, running around the forest where the faint sounds of branches are breaking around me, and they're not animals. I look around and start my run. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone's in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shut out my intense stomach feeling. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite it being wet. It was dark. I jog as fast as I can. I'm panicking because the path is far away and I do not feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound is muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for longer than last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly was making me slightly loose of my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I was really sure that I might not be going the right way. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mum, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mum was screaming on the phone at the same time. time that they're on the path and that I need to run. Now apparently my dad had actually gotten out and was heading east from the path behind. I was so terrified I went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walking again because I'm out of breath. But then, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder now. I don't dare to look over my shoulder. That's when I first saw what was in the forest with me, a tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a hidden secret, sprinting ability, or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I really mean it. I screamed out, "I'm on the phone to the police, they're on the path with you. Dad, I can see you, I'm here." I wanted to yell, "Dad, please tell me where you are," but of course I was too smart for that. I felt like something awful was about to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard that my eyes hurt. I feel shivers. I've never felt fear quite like it. It doesn't feel real. This just can't be happening to me. My legs feel like they're not working. I finally hear my dad shouting my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intuition of his voice. I pretty much lunged at him. We catch one another. But Dad heard the bell too. My mum could hear it on the phone waiting in the car. We went directly to the police station. I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said he could hear the bell, and thought he wouldn't be able to see me. Asked if I didn't have my phone, and what would have happened then. They were almost as terrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me running and the danger and couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area and they just found a folded up t-shirt under a rock. And my bag was never recovered. They said it was probably someone homeless in the forest, but what actually happened to me that day just doesn't make sense for somebody to be homeless. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing's my fault. There are just so many what ifs. I want to believe it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt, but were a bit mentally unstable and they felt anger that I come into their territory. But this was too insidious. This was too planned and methodic. They must have known that I was out there alone, and that I was far from help. To this day, I can't bloody go anywhere near where I'm gonna be alone or the sound of bells. I struggle with the smell of moss too. Anyway, I'm so thankful for my parents and my phone that I was able to actually write this now, because God knows what would have happened if I didn't have them two things. This story took place over 30 years ago and is from my childhood. Now, I didn't live too far away from some fields and a forest, and I would often go there just to have some nice fresh air and to get away from everything. This all changed one day, however. It wasn't a product of my own complacency, more so randomness that I'm going to get into. Now, I set off on this day like all my others, happy, and it's a nice comfortable walk-in pace. I have to go through a couple of fields and jump a gate, move past a power line, and just jump over a small stream. Now I'm at the start of the forest. There's moss covering most of the trees here. I know my way round pretty well, so I never worry too much. I feel very at peace here, but I don't like to overstay, because I know it can take a while to get back, and my thoughts can sometimes turn on me. So I continue like normal. I decide to stop for a second. I have a strange feeling that something's off, that I can't quite put my finger on. The feeling actually doesn't go away, and it's kind of frustrating. I decide to just close my eyes and lay back for a second. That turns into a 10-minute nap. I check my watch. I think, wow, it's been 3 hours, but I look again, it's only been 10 minutes. As I open my eyes, I get a little confused and readjust to my surroundings. I know I'm still in the same spot because my bag's there, but there are rocks that have perfectly been arranged in a circle around me, along with a big X next to my bag. I know for a fact that I haven't done this in my sleep. I call out for anyone, and suddenly, I hear a strange tapping on a tree further in the distance. I don't bother sticking around to investigate. I grab my bag and begin to sprint back as fast as I possibly can. I never went back to that forest, and I never told anyone about my experience until now. I still have no idea what the hell that was or what it could have meant. I still get nightmares sometimes just thinking about it. Even now, I'm starting to feel paranoid and feeling my palms sweat just typing this. This happened many years ago, when I was 17. I'm now a 30-year-old male for context. When I was a teenager, I lived in Marin County, a quiet suburb just north of San Francisco. However, most of my buddies lived in San Francisco, and most nights I could be found riding my bike around from and across Golden Gate Bridge. I really enjoyed long bicycle rides at night. I'd often be high as a kite, iPod on my favourite playlist, passing by weirdos and street urchins, admiring the desolate beauty of the bay. One of my favourite places to ride my bike was through Poseido. Poseido is the last neighbourhood you pass in San Francisco before making your way onto the Golden Gate Bridge. It's famous for its old and beautiful military housing. There's also enormous eucalyptus trees and forestry. At night, it's dead and quiet, and the only people you can see out are late-night Chinese fishermen on the pier down by the water, or people flying down the freeway into the city. Anyway, this one night I was coming back from hanging out with some friend, riding my bike through there on the way home. It was leisurely, going past the hills and the trees, when I noticed a single older black car, something like an Oldsmobile, coming up on a perpendicular road to me. As I get closer, it took a left, blinding me for a moment as it passes. I don't think much of it at the time, but here and there you might see a couple cruising to go and make out by the bridge, or a car full of kids gonna smoke something near there, at the old pet cemetery beneath the highway. A few minutes later, I had mostly climbed up the hill, and that takes me closer to the entrance of the bridge that looks down on Crissy Field. This road is dark with barely any lights, and I was enjoying looking down towards the water to my right when I noticed a car coming from behind me. I looked behind me and saw the same old black Oldsmobile, maybe 20 yards behind me with its lights off, driving very strangely at a crawl speed. I tried to wave past them, but the car just keeps on strolling slowly behind me. It was too dark to see who might be driving. The fact that the car had its lights off almost immediately struck me as a red flag, as well as the fact that it was deliberately tailgating me. I gave it a few more yards and tried to wave it past, but nothing. I'm now spooked. I took a sharp left on my bicycle and began bombing down the hill in the opposite way. This route would take me back deeper into a more secluded wooded area by the cemetery and air hangars. For a moment, I felt relieved until I heard a screeching of car wheels and glanced behind me to see the Oldsmobile with its lights off now passing behind the trees coming down the same hill as me. Now the Oldsmobile would have had to have made an extremely unusual U-turn, especially considering how narrow the roads are. Terrified now, I began pedaling faster away from the Oldsmobile, but as I pick up pace, so does the Oldsmobile. Using all my strength, I go as quick as I can up a hill through some trees, jumping off the bike. I now run to find a bush to hide in. Hanging off the side of the hill, hidden in ivy, I was just below the road. I look up, but couldn't see anything. I suddenly hear the car pass and wait a few minutes before I heard it slowly approaching, no indication from headlights, and then pass by again and again for nearly 20 minutes or so, and I'm terrified hiding in the bush. Finally, I mustered the courage to get back on my bicycle, riding as fast as I possibly can back to the bridge. In the darkness, listening to myself pant. It felt like forever, but finally, I can see the glaring lights of the Golden Gate Bridge. But then again, I heard the car. I look behind me to see it. I smash through and make it to the parking lot. I rode up the pedestrian sidewalk next to the toll, get off my bike, under the light and chain smoke for a while. I never saw the car again on the bridge, nor did I see it again when I made it back to Marin. Back when I was younger, I used to enjoy going for walks through a forested area to go and see my friend. Now, it wasn't a very long walk, but the woods were long enough to get lost in. I had my good friend. I would always go and see him, and we'd always hang out. Never in the forest per se, but we always passed through it to get to things we wanted to do, and this day was no different. I've already met up with my friend now, and we're just going through a pass. As we do so, we notice an overwhelming smell of smoke. This is weird because we've never really smelt it like this before. We think maybe a building's on fire near us. We end up sitting down and talking for a while. We know we're going to be too early for the film we're going to watch, so we decide just to hunker down. Within about 10 minutes, we realise that visibility's dropped and the smell of smoke is truly overwhelming. We get up and realise that there's actually a fire only a few meters away from us. We look around and panic sets in as we realise that about half of the forest is actually on fire, and we're trapped. We both let out screams as we realise what's happening, and due to parts of the burnt forest we can't actually figure out which way we need to go to get out. I tell my friend to cover his face with his shirt and just follow me. There's only one way we can get out, down a small stream, and I know roughly where it should be. It's now getting very hot around us and I can hear fire engines in the distance. We end up making it to the stream, and we literally have to jump in because there's fire on both sides of us. We make it through and eventually manage to make it to a road. Now, what makes this even more terrifying is that it come into the local news a few days later that a crazy person was trying to set fire to this whole forest knowing there were people in it. The fact that me and my friend were sitting there talking so oblivious still haunts me to this day. When I was younger, every year for Christmas, I would drive upstate to my aunt's house along a stretch of highway. I can't for the life of me remember the road. All I know is that it runs near Aachen, New York at some point. It's mostly a drive through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. So it's the dead of night, and my groggy self has gotten off a long shift and had to drag myself to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realise I'm very low on gas. It annoys me. My brother told me he filled it up, but he hasn't. I saw an archaic looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with gas off the next exit or something. That seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruit stands on the highway, so whatever. I pull off of the next exit on some dilapidated country road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running at me. Eventually I come to the gas station and realise quickly that it's not been open for years. It was all rusted, and the convenience store roof is caving in. The gas pumps had all been taken out as well. I pull over next to it and check my gauge. I would probably only make it another half mile before running out, so I called AAA, and they said they're gonna send a truck. Now the waiting game. I left my engine on because of the headlights, and it's pitch black, and my paranoid self didn't want to be sitting next to an abandoned gas station in the dark for what felt like forever. So most of the wait is actually uneventful, until I sense movement around the side of the old store where my lights are pointed. I look up and didn't see anything more, so I look back down at my phone. Then, over the sound of the night, I hear someone yell, "Hey buddy, come here," in a demanding tone. I look up, and there's a guy standing by the old store staring down at me, illuminated by my headlights. He looks like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was spooked and figured that he must have been squatting there watching me. I say, "Yeah, what's up? You got any change?" "Nah, sorry man." I look up at him, and he has this vacant expression. Then I see more movement. There are heads, about 20 or so, peeking around the trees beyond the man I'm talking to. I can't see them clearly, but there are definitely people there. Literally just heads, staring in the direction from around the trees. I then see another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, so I peel off. I get as far away from that place as I can, and update the AAA on my location. The driver came back over and filled me up. I didn't say anything, but he left, and I want to call the cops. I called the nearest sheriff department. When I get to my aunt's house, they called me back and said they're all gone, but they found a lot of different signs that people have been living there. The whole situation freaks me out, but frankly, I consider myself lucky to be able to even tell this story, knowing that nothing happened to me. My mum was always very cautious of the bad things that could happen to her children. She would take all three of us, my brother, sister and I, to school, all at the same time in the morning, and she works very close to where the school is. I remembered I was begging to bike to school since I got a new bike for my birthday, and she agrees. I was in grade 7, so 12 or 13. My school was a 2 to 3 minute drive away, and probably a 10-minute bike ride. I was eager to ride my new bike to school, as I also had gotten a new helmet and lock as well. School starts at about 9, so I left at 8. I liked to hang out in the yard with my friends before school started, so I would always go earlier. The route to school was pretty much one straight line, and we get into the city. Now it's 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's relatively bright out again. I'm on a well-populated main road. So I'm about halfway to school, and I decide to cross the street, but not at a crosswalk or traffic light, just kind of jaywalk in. I'm looking both ways though, and I noticed a black car pull up to my left near the woods. It's a Honda Civic, and there's 2 young guys in there, well, sort of young, but they got tinted windows, and I don't think much of it. The only thing that crosses my mind is, maybe I was blocking them from their driveway and continued down. From the corner of my eye though, I saw a man dressed in all black with his hood popped up, hide his face, get out to the driver's side and walk around the back of the car to the passenger side before I realise what's happening. He's opening the passenger door, and he's pulling me by the arm off my bike trying to get me in. As for what felt like an eternity, after what felt like an eternity, it was like every car on the street had disappeared. Any sign of help was gone. I'm on one of the busiest streets in my city, and it feels like a graveyard. It really feels like one of them nightmares where you can't actually do anything. You just lay there and suffer until you wake up. Now these things don't really happen in my city, so I'm not really prepared for this. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind is to aim for the nuts. I shifted my weight to my right leg and kick as hard as I possibly can. Landing one kick, I actually hurt my ankle, so I can't imagine how it felt receiving that. I didn't even look before I crossed the street, biking as fast as I can. I remember trying to turn around to get a license plate, but my eyes are very watery from fear. I knew my mum wouldn't have been at work, so I continued biking to school silently crying. I pull into the schoolyard and drop my bike off. I didn't care to lock it or ever ride it anywhere again. My school's front door is locked 24/7, and you had to ring a doorbell to get in. The serenity reminded me that I still had time to play outside before class starts, and that's when I finally speak again. I need to call my mum. I scream and the door opens instantly. I explain what happened to the secretary, then the principal, and my mum and the police. Now, a business across the street had some surveillance footage, but you can only see the bottom 6 inches of the guy's car pulling up, so that was no use. Apparently, the same guy with the same description went on an attempt to kidnap 3 other girls but never got caught. I don't really believe in God, but I do pray that he/whatever it was never successful. Now, I'm new to Reddit, but this is my experience. So this happened when I was a lot younger. I want to say freshman in high school, probably like 2008. There used to be this road near where I lived in CA called Croak Road. It was barely a road. No one travelled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses. I would typically go there with my friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night, I was hanging out with 2 of my friends, Lucas and Durain, and somebody wanted to go to Croak Road and hang out since it's creepy. It might sound lame, but we loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders that weren't really into smoking or anything like that. I asked my 20-year-old brother James if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon, one particular path we're travelling down becomes so narrow that James' Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it, so we got out and walked for a while, chatting, having fun. We go through the woods for about an hour until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun's gone, at which point we turn around and head back to the car. It's now I should mention that despite being near a lot of sub-developments, this patch of forest is huge and rarely visited since it was so easy to get lost in, especially at night. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James manages it, and we're going down the road. Durain proposed that we turn down a different path which we had passed by earlier, since we had about another 40 minutes until our parents want us back, and we agree. Down this path was a tiny pond Durain wanted to check out and take pictures at, since he hadn't got the opportunity to go at night. It was slow going since the road was even creepier than the main one we're on, but we turned off Croak Road. Minutes later, we got into a slight argument. Durain was convinced James had taken a wrong turn since we shouldn't have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. Eventually we come to a fork in the road that none of us are familiar with. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything. In fact, we were actually excited and intrigued, driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night. It was at this point we rounded a small bend in the road and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. There's 4 figures emerging from the forest crossing the road wearing what appears to be cloaks. One guy at the back was dragging a large duffel bag. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they freeze too. James pulled up to the left and went around them, Driving past them really felt like an eternity though, because we couldn't have been going over 5 miles per hour due to the condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches behind my window, and they're indeed wearing black robes. I didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was, something heavy is inside the bag. None of us said a word until the road straightened out, and we're far past those guys. At which point, James mutters, "What the hell was that?" We continued down the road in silence, and I heard Lucas say, "Wow, they're coming back." I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing out the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. The guys were without a doubt running after us, all of them screaming. We start to tell James to step on it. The car bounces and shakes uncontrollably as we flew over beams and potholes. Thank God we did manage to get back to the main path. James gunned it down the path until we're popped off by Croak Road and we get the hell out of there. This is the weirdest thing though. The creepiest thing that I realise is none of them had a vehicle, so they must have been about 50 miles away from anything and they were just out there in the woods with that body thing in the bag. We ended up calling the cops, but they can't find anything. I never told my parents about it until writing this. I haven't really shared it with anyone. It's very important you report suspicious people. I still wish to hell to know how they got there, where they were going, and what was in the bag. Though sometimes I think it's better for me not to know. Hey folks, I'm kind of new to this, but this happened just after I went to a Christmas Eve party when everyone goes home and I decide to stay because my cousin and I were watching a movie. My uncle, who used to walk his dogs in the woods next to a park, went off to take them out. Before this, my aunt told him don't do that because it's too dark out there, and around 5 AM. He didn't care. He went off anyway. My aunt was still worried, so I went along with him. Once we're actually there, nothing wrong really seems to happen. My uncle and his dogs are just relaxing, and I don't really pay much attention to the surroundings when suddenly the dogs go still. This wasn't strange. They always do this and stare and bark at animals, but this time it was different. When the dogs got still, my uncle and I noticed that something was wrong. The dog wasn't angry or anything, just kind of nervous and anxious or afraid. One of the dogs, the largest one, was growling and shaking. As my uncle started to get worried about the situation, we heard it. People in the woods. We couldn't actually see how many were there because of the darkness. Now we're all gathered here by the blood of we, thee, and thy. As my uncle and I heard that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him out of the woods. As we all left, he turned his back, and we only see a slight movement in the shrubs. Maybe these people were trying to hide. We ended up quickly getting the dogs and getting out of there. We never actually took the time to investigate who they were or what they were doing, but after that happened, my uncle didn't take his dogs near those woods ever again, and is very scared of being out late now. When I was 7 years old, my father took my older brother and I to a cabin in the middle of nowhere as a vacation. We also took our cat with us. Everyone has their own room. I had the room furthest from the other two, positioned right next to where the wood starts. There was a window right next to my bed, and on the right side, and there was a tree right next to it that I remembered getting to climb in the previous day without success. The bedrooms were on the 2nd floor, by the way, and the window didn't have any curtains or blinds to cover it. Now one night, I remembered feeling homesick and unable to sleep. The cats are laying on the bed with me. I was reading comic books at around 2 AM when I heard tapping on my window. I assume it's a branch tapping on the window because it's windy, but I hear whispers now, I remember just freezing in my fear, feeling like a bunch of ice water's been poured on me. I could hear whoever it was tapping, saying, "Let me in," and my name, "It's cold out here." I just want to cuddle. I was paralyzed by fear. I just lay there, facing away from the window, terrified close to tears. I've honestly never had anything like this before. I was so paralyzed by fear that I just faced away from the window. I knew it wasn't my father. He kept saying that, but it's a lie and it's my imagination. I grabbed my cat, feeling safer with him, my only defense. I couldn't believe this guy had the nerve to call himself my dad. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted. I hear a screeching sound now, like somebody's got a pocket knife against glass. Now the grin disappears on his face and he just looks like he's horrified and absolutely full of rage. At that moment, my father come barreling into my room with his hunting rifle, and as you can imagine, seeing this made him panic and sort of drop backwards. My father just looked at me to make sure I was alright, just as my brother came running in. He wants to catch him, but unfortunately he got away. To this day, I don't think they ever caught the guy. I remember my father filing a police report. Sadly, they never actually found this guy, and he might still be out there to this day.